As we light our chalice, you may want to pause and light your own candle at home, or just open to light in your heart and your mind and your body as we recite our chalice lighting from the Passover Haggadah. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of Life.
Unison affirmation of covenant and mission. Our covenant is to be a loving, joyful community that nurtures spiritual growth, promotes compassion, social responsibility, and service in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice.
Even though we are apart, we have another opportunity to participate together as we hold our joys and sorrows, those celebrations and concerns we all have for those we love, those we know, and so much lately, even for the whole nation and the wide world. This morning, what are your joys? What are your sorrows?
Right.
Greetings from the lockdown bunker here in Meadville. It's always a pleasure to get the chance to sermonize, even if it's remotely during a pandemic. Thanks as always to Karen for the invitation and to Jody for all your technical help behind the scenes. When Jody asked me for a title a few weeks ago, I hadn't yet come up with a specific idea, so naturally I just gave her a title. Well, I gave her the most generic title I could imagine, which was Some Thoughts About the Current Crisis and What It Tells Us About Our Society. What I didn't know at the time was that we'd be embroiled in so many crises at once. I had originally planned to focus on the public health crisis and subsequent economic fallout caused by the coronavirus. Then George Floyd was murdered, and now it seems public attention has shifted to the deep-rooted crises of our inner cities and the problem of police violence towards Black and brown populations. So what I want to talk about is actually both of these crises, because I think they're related. On the one hand, the coronavirus crisis has exposed some fundamental cracks in our social system. On the other hand, the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the unprecedented wave of protests that followed has resurfaced some fundamental cracks in our racialized system of policing and mass incarceration. So what I want to talk about today are how these two systems are connected. And I'm going to start with the American social system, which has magnified the devastation brought by the coronavirus. So currently, the United States leads the world in coronavirus cases and deaths. The U.S. has roughly 4% of the world's population and 33% of coronavirus cases. As of June 10, we lead the world in the number of confirmed coronavirus deaths at 112,000. That's almost 3 times the number of deaths of the next highest country, the United Kingdom, which has roughly 40,000. So something is clearly wrong here, because not only do we have 4% of the world's population, but 33% of the cases and the overwhelming number of deaths, we're also the richest country in the world. And we're often told by our political leaders that we have the best healthcare system, the best doctors, the greatest doctors, and so on. But if that's the case, then why do we lead the world in coronavirus cases and deaths? The answer, I would suggest, is that we're suffering not so much from a virus, as dangerous as that is, we're suffering from a social system that isn't working, especially when it comes to providing people the things they need during a pandemic. Right now, we're the only industrialized country in the world that does not guarantee comprehensive health care to its citizens. Likewise, we're one of only 14 countries out of 193 total that does not provide paid sick leave to workers. This means that workers are out, they're at gas stations, construction sites, retail stores, shop floors, even if they're sick, because they have no other option. They're forced to work or lose their job. And this obviously makes it easier for the virus to spread. The lack of worker protections that we provide in the U.S. endangers the whole community, and so does the lack of universal health care. Right now, the average cost of hospital treatment for coronavirus is $30,000. Some insurance companies aren't even covering the cost. In March, a Boston woman tested positive for coronavirus after 3 trips to the emergency room and was billed $34,000 for tests and treatment. A Pennsylvania native named Frank Wuchinskia tested negative for the virus in March after returning from Wuhan, China, but that didn't stop the hospital from sending him a $4,000 bill. Similarly, in Miami, a man tested negative for the virus, but his health insurance provider required him to pay a $1,400 deductible, and also to provide 3 years of medical records to prove that his flu-like symptoms were not related to a pre-existing condition. If he didn't provide the records, he would have owed $3,000. This is our healthcare system right now. These cases highlight our failure to deal with a public health emergency and how it's not some natural disaster. It's not an act of God, despite what we've been hearing. It's the product of a system built around for-profit medical treatment and corporations seeking to make money off a basic human need for healthcare. That's the system we have. That's a man-made system. As the writer Megan Day has noted, quote, "A virus can make a person sick enough to need a ventilator, but it can't create a shortage of ventilators. That's not the result of nature, but of medical device companies promising to build them, even taking public money, taxpayer money, to do so, then failing to build them because it wasn't profitable." Day goes on to write, "The coronavirus didn't cause our understaffed and under-resourced hospitals. So-called lean production and hospital management did that. It didn't cause an unemployment rate that rivals the Great Depression. The United States' unwillingness to protect workers' jobs did that. The coronavirus didn't cause millions of newly unemployed people to lose their private health insurance during a public health crisis. The United States' stubborn refusal to implement a single-payer health system did that. What allowed each of these systems to atrophy," Day concludes, "is the brazenly pro-corporate disposition of American governance and the successful suppression of a working-class mass movement that might reverse it." The mainstream media doesn't cover this aspect of the crisis. They're too busy covering Trump's tweets and press conferences. The same goes, we could say, for the crisis of militarized policing in the inner cities. Very rarely do we hear about the underlying social and economic causes of that problem. Of course, we all know the racial disparities. We know that in the U.S., police shoot and kill black people at twice the rate of white people. We know that racist policing is part of the problem. We know that the system is clearly racialized, but what does that mean exactly? What system or systems are we talking about? The slogan, "Defund the police," it's become a new mantra among activists, and for good reason. As David Sirota has shown, spending on police has far outpaced population growth over the last 30 years and drained resources from other public priorities. New York's police budget, for example, is more than the city spends on health, homelessness, youth development, and workforce development combined. So we're basically talking about a system that siphons money away from things like healthcare, housing, education, jobs, and other social services in order to funnel cash into an ever larger militarized police force. And what are these militarized police forces charged with doing? What's their function? The political scientist Cedric Johnson has argued that the basic function of militarized police is social control. The police exist, Johnson says, to manage and contain a huge and growing surplus population, often confined to ghettoized zones of the inner city, blighted inner ring suburbs, and depopulated Rust Belt towns. Indeed, the common denominator among victims of police violence is that they live in impoverished areas. In this sense, violent regimes of policing are, Johnson says, the product of an approach to policing that emerges from an imperative to contain and suppress the pockets of economically marginal and sub-employed working class populations produced by revanchist capitalism. This is why, if we want to do something, and I mean really do something about racialized patterns of police violence, we have to do something about the economic system that militarized policing is designed to protect. We have to connect the problem of racial inequality to the problem of economic inequality. As Michelle Alexander recently wrote in the New York Times, we cannot achieve racial justice and create a secure and thriving democracy without also transforming our economic systems. As an example, Alexander points to Martin Luther King Jr., who in a 1952 letter to his wife realized that, quote, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. King would later go on to draft the long-forgotten Freedom Budget, a document that he co-wrote alongside socialist labor leaders A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin during the so-called race riots of 1967. If that date sounds familiar, it's because a lot of commentators have likened that moment, the so-called race riots in the late 60s, where there were widespread protests and destructive violence. Many have likened that moment to our current moment. So when King and Randolph and Rustin are writing at that time, and they're putting forward a proposal for dealing with racial inequality and social unrest, it's unlike our contemporary conversations, which often call for incremental technical reforms or more diversity initiatives or an increased commitment to or renewed commitment to affirmative action. On the other hand, the Freedom Budget, the document written by King and Rustin and Randolph, the Freedom Budget calls for a robust program of economic justice as the answer. And that includes nothing less, and I'm quoting here, nothing less than wiping out poverty, full employment for all Americans, guaranteed income for all Americans, education for all, housing for all, health care for all. That's their answer. Its focus on the issue of jobs, incomes, health care, housing. The Freedom Budget echoes King's radical realization in 1967 when he told the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I'm going to quote again, this is King, "We can't solve our problem now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. We must see that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others." What King knew then, and what many of us could learn from him now, is that you can't separate the problem of racism and racial disparity from the problem of capitalism and economic inequality and exploitation. If you want to do something about racial inequality, you've got to address the political economy. Otherwise, you're just making pretenses, a show of your own moral righteousness. You're just doing what Democratic Party leaders did this week when they showed their support by taking a knee against racist policing, while at the same time openly opposing Medicare for all, free higher education, and the expansion of other public goods. These are the things we need right now, but they're also the things we lack because of generations of public disinvestment. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have worked for decades to cut whatever remains of our social safety net, leaving us completely unprepared to deal with the crises at hand. If you're outraged by this, I know I am, and I hope you are too. You should be. But I want to finish by cautioning against a common trap, one that's embodied in this democratic establishment response, one that substitutes a demonstration, a symbolic demonstration of moral outrage for actual political change. And that's the trap of simply bearing witness to suffering. The trap that makes us feel individually righteous if we simply show solidarity, whether that's on Facebook or through conversations with our neighbors, or by putting up a Black Lives Matter sign, or even by participating in a protest. While those actions are certainly useful in the moment, they draw a lot of public attention and visibility to a problem, but they cannot substitute for the necessary and protracted work of political organizing. As King made clear, our problems are not simply moral problems. They're not just about making us better people. They are political problems. What this means is that it requires us to do more than simply bear witness and show solidarity. It requires us to commit, in King's words, to redistributing economic and political power. So it goes without saying, I'm sure especially to members of the UU Church, that we should all be against racism and discrimination. But what about capitalism? Are you willing to follow King's lead there? Are you willing to call for an end to economic exploitation, which makes capitalism possible? Here's Walter. He's against economic exploitation as much as anything. What about the 40 million Americans who live in poverty? That number is larger than the entire population of Canada, but I don't see any nationwide protests about it. 40 million people live in poverty in the United States. Where's the outrage? Or what about the 26,000 Americans who die each year because they lack health insurance? We only seem to notice these problems in times of crisis. But should we only protect people in a state of emergency? Should we only give people Medicare for all, but just for the coronavirus? Even before the pandemic, 80% of American workers were living paycheck to paycheck. 52% of Meadville could not afford the basic cost of living. Again, where is the outrage here? Where are the protests? Why aren't people calling for systemic change about this? We're often told that change requires us to just be kinder, better people, to love your neighbor, to check your privilege, to be more sympathetic and understanding toward the victims of racism or economic exploitation or poverty. But that kind of story is a trap. Solving our problems of poverty and economic exploitation and racism ultimately don't require us to be better people. They require us, as King said, to get rid of capitalism, to redistribute economic and political power. If we're not willing to do this, we're just pretending. Thank you very much.